Sometimes I despair the world will never see another age of enlightenment. Now it's time for the Fort Mac Philosopher Show.
All right, folks, it's the Fort Mac Philosopher here. And today I have a special guest. I've been working with this guy all week. This is a guy from the other side of the table, I guess, in a sense. He's kind of a left-wing guy involved in the progressive movement in the States. He's been an environmental activist who has had, come from a fairly extreme, one would almost brand him an eco-terrorist at one point in his life because he would smash it, and I kind of dig it. Andy Cobb is here with us. I've been working with this guy all week, and so I thought it'd be great to have a discussion because part of what I do here on this show is try to model a dialogue with people that you would think at first blush you would be mortal enemies, you wouldn't be able to agree on anything, and show how we might be able to advance dialogue forward and create a better world, ultimately, a more peaceful world, a more virtuous world. So, Andy, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Talk a little bit about, I don't want to keep you here very long because folks, we're coming to the end of a grueling 6-day week of filming in Alberta's oil sands, and Mike, and it's midnight, and they have a flight to catch in about 4 or 5 hours. So I appreciate your generosity with your time.
Absolutely.
And I would just like to see if we can talk a little bit about environmental issues. So talk a little bit about global warming, environmentalism, and talk about the kind of problem this presents.
Sure. I believe that climate change is the issue that matters. That our other issues that are very important are going to be dwarfed by this one and eclipsed in the very near future in sort of dramatic and potentially very horrible ways. And in learning about it, in researching this project, we've been to NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratories and talked to climate scientists and talked to a number of very knowledgeable people and very highly regarded people in their field. And what they have to say is very depressing and very troubling. And it's almost such an enormous issue and such a dangerous issue that it can be a source of a lot of stress, and it is something that I lose sleep over, and it is something that I think about a lot. And to really understand it and really get sort of your mental arms around it, I think a little humor can be very useful. So
Right.
So it's something that I'm trying to do. One thing that I've always tried to do in my professional life is blend comedy with sort of issues that don't naturally take to comedy, and
Right.
I think that's a fun challenge to take on.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm trying to do with this project, but it's born out of a very serious issue, and it's almost so serious that to really cope with it mentally, I think there has to be a little bit of laughter.
Yeah, I mean, you maybe before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how you see we might be able to solve some of these issues, talk a little bit about, because quite often, especially in Fort McMurray, we're sensitive to environmentalists. I mean, we get drive-by journalists constantly berating our town, talking about the social problems here, talking about how it looks like Hiroshima or Mordor or something like that. And so residents here are fairly sensitive, and all the time on threads on social media, you hear people saying things like, what you're doing is disgusting, shut it down immediately, you're killing people, it's all this kind of rhetoric. And so it's very easy for us to dismiss the left as that's representative of people who have environmental concerns. All they do is lob bombs, verbal insulting bombs all day and put us on the defensive. Now, I found my experience with you to be vastly different than that. Would you say that you're indicative of the environmental movement? Or can we expect more of this kind of?
Well, I think that Fort McMurray is the focus of the environmental or a lot of the environmental movement for important reasons. The KXL pipeline potentially could be moving 93 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere per year for 50 years. So it's not that anyone I think wants to pick on Fort McMurray,
Sure,
or the oil sands, or I think that it's for real reasons, and it's also a center of industry. It's a center of commerce. There's an enormous amount of money being made, and a lot of that's going to hardworking men and women, and I'm all for hardworking men and women making good wages. We work on the left. We work hard to secure living wages for working men and women. So obviously there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in taking actions that might jeopardize anybody's wages.
sure.
That's something that everybody I know on the left takes very seriously.
Right.
And so to me, the environmental movement has to find ways to grow and adapt and get better at what it does, because the fact is that we haven't been, by we, I mean the environmental movement.
Yeah, you're speaking on behalf of them.
Yeah, it's a bit much for me to speak on behalf of the environmental movement, but here I go. But we have not been very good at what we do. We haven't made much progress on this issue.
Yeah.
And we, to the extent that is anyone who is trying to fight climate change, isn't doing the job. It's not
Sure.
It's not happening. The trend lines and the numbers look really fucking bad.
Right.
And so I think we do have to be open to new routes that might not be emotionally satisfying. You mentioned some of my old days back in the day, well beyond the statute of limitations. Thank you very much. I used to be with a group called Earth First, or not be with a group. No one is with Earth First. You're part of this. Well, whatever. But I participated in actions with Earth First, and they involved smashing office equipment and construction equipment and things like that to try and slow down or stop development that we thought was harmful. And looking back, it was just so very fucking stupid and ineffective. And we never, all that stuff felt really good. Like it felt
Right.
good. Like it's an issue that makes me angry, and so it felt good to smash things. And you're in your 20s, and it's fun to smash things. I loved the sound of breaking glass at that age. So all those things were very emotionally satisfying, but they didn't do jack shit. And I think we need to find ways to operate that are going to be smarter and more interesting, and perhaps focus on ways of organizing and bringing people together that we haven't done before. And there's been a lot of success in this.
Right.
In the States, there have been groups coming together to fight things like the KXL pipeline. That involved conservative ranchers in places like Nebraska and Texas, people who traditionally are on the opposite end sides of battle lines with progressives, but joining forces to fight something that was harmful to them both. Right. So I don't think that we can afford to be on the opposite side of working men and women. I think we have to find common ground with working men and women everywhere, because ultimately it's not the miner's fault for taking a job and taking a paycheck.
Right.
And I don't think it's my fault for needing to get to Hollywood to go do my job, or to Santa Monica or wherever else. I think if we're going to point the steely finger of blame, and I do have that finger.
Where's it going to go?
Oh, right up my butt. Oh, delicious. No, but it's. I'm a crude man, forgive me, but I think that that it goes towards the leadership, corporate leaders, political leaders, business leaders, that we've been failed over and over again by people not acting in the interest of the people that they in various ways represent.
Right, and let me just riff on that a little bit, because I don't totally disagree with you here. We have been failed by leadership on all levels, and that leadership, to me, I take it even a step farther and try to understand, if I'm a leader, what are the incentives that are driving me to make the decisions I'm making. And a lot of that has to do, well, almost all of it has to do with the beliefs of my constituency, whether it's my customers or my voters or whatever. If I want to keep my job, if I want to stay in that place of power and prestige or whatever it is, I have to represent the aggregate of beliefs that my constituency has, or I'm just not going to be there. Would that be fair to say?
I guess I would disagree. I guess that you have a little bit more faith in democratization in both the business world and political world than I do. I don't believe that corporate leaders are acting in my best interest. I believe they are. I believe they are legally beholden to act in the best interest of stockholders.
Right.
And I don't own any stock, and shareholders in their company. I believe that political leaders, to a certain extent, are that they are more accountable than business leaders to the populace, because we get to vote. We don't get a vote in a corporation. But we that vote is, at least in my country, tainted by a lot of corporate money and a lot of big capital. So I wish I shared your optimism. To a certain extent, there's gray areas, but I think we need to move to democratize these centers of power and find ways to hold them accountable. And hopefully the arts are a means to do that, one of many.
And I wouldn't disagree with you. And we've had some conversations about this, and I think I may have introduced you to some ideas from a libertarian perspective about creating environmental stewardship and moving forward, that maybe libertarians could add to the dialogue. And I'm no corporate apologist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a fan of corporations. I see them as a byproduct of the state, and again, of the state as an aggregate of the beliefs of people. So if you're a corporation, if you're a CEO of a corporation, a legal fiction, and that is created to protect your ass from ever having to pay for your crimes and the harm you cause, the way you succeed in that position and get into that position is to cozy up to the people that have the power, and that's the politicians. So it's a tragic cycle. I mean, in a lot of ways, it reflects exactly this tragic cycle you're trying to understand with oil consumption in LA and production up here. And so a big part of the problem. And so a big part of the problem that I see is, or the way forward, from my perspective, is changing hearts and minds at a grassroots level, and hopefully, eventually, leadership will reflect the hearts and minds of people, and because ultimately, from a libertarian perspective, the problem with the environment is a property rights issue. Pollution is an invasion of someone's property rights. It's harm on a person. It's harm on their property. And so the people that are responsible for that harm need to bear the cost. They need to restore justice. They need to compensate victims. They need to stop doing what they're doing. And so we need to find ways of connecting property owners, individual people, whether they're First Nations people in Fort Chip, or whether they're people in this community, whether they're people in the United States concerned about Keystone, expropriating their land. We need to connect these. We need to empower their property rights so that they don't have to worry about pollution, that they don't have to worry about their land being expropriated. To me, that's part of the way forward, and that's something that I think environmentalists would do well to join forces with libertarian, because there's a growing movement of libertarian environmentalists, and we want to be part of the dialogue, and we think we have some valuable ways moving forward, we can offer a different perspective, looking at the same problem with the same goals in mind.
Yeah, fair enough, and I think that's a good point, and I believe it's incumbent on the environmental movement, if we really believe this is a global threat, we should be open to a variety of different kinds of creative solutions, and that's certainly among them. And I think in our discussion we hit upon something that doesn't necessarily. I wouldn't describe it as a libertarian perspective, because it does involve state regulation. But to me, I think that we do agree that ultimately it's about paying for damage that one does, right. and we're all doing damage. This isn't to say, damn you, Fort McMurray, how dare you mine this stuff. We could just as easily say, damn you, Los Angeles, why do you use this stuff? Right. But ultimately it comes down to paying for the damage that's being done, and we either pay now or we pay later, and we know it's much more expensive later. So if we pay now, it's about paying a carbon tax, and that's not really, it's not my idea, and it's not a brand new idea. It's kind of an old one, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. But like a lot of things that make a lot of sense in this discussion, it gets overwhelmed by, at least in my country, by the big money behind those folks who don't want to see that idea addressed. And that also goes for investing in new types of technology. These things can produce well-paying jobs that can't be outsourced. Yeah. Rebuilding the electrical grid for North America would produce North American jobs that can't be outsourced. So these types of things can produce the sorts of, to use a horrible cliche, win-win. Let me add another one, paradigms that will create. Let me add another one, synergy. Man, the fucking trifecta. But you know what I'm saying? These things can produce some really great outcomes. But what's standing in the way, and I'm trying to learn more about your country, but at least for my people, the problem is real clear, and the problem is this vast concentration of wealth in the hands of people who intend to maintain a monopoly on power. Right. People like the Koch brothers are a common example of that.
Yeah, and I guess what my concern would be is increasing those bastions of power, right? And so I worry about things like carbon tax and different things like that, creating a center of power. So there's a monopoly on regulating the carbon that's produced, and that's going to lead to an incentive for people with money to cozy up to it's a never-ending cycle. That's my worry. I mean, we can talk about that another time. I kind of want to stay focused on the environment, because I think we could go off on a number of tangents here. But,
and we have. When we drove to Fort Chip, I think we discussed and solved pretty much every issue under the sun. So I'm just trying to review.
Yeah, we did solve the world's problems. We forgot to write it down though, because
it's a fucking dragon.
And we forgot about it. Let me just go back to climate change for a little bit and talk to you a little bit about that. So you chose Fort McMurray, kind of understandably, because Keystone XL is a big thing on the environmental activism radar down in the States. I guess some of the things that people up here might ask are, in terms of triaging greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of triaging environmental destruction, it seems that Fort McMurray is kind of small potatoes in a lot of ways, or the oil sands industry, I should say. Canada, I think, emits something under 2% of global greenhouse gases, and of Canada's greenhouse emissions, the oil sands produce about 5%. Los Angeles, the city, produces more greenhouse gas than the whole oil sands operation, and coal power. Oil sands represent about 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions of U.S. Coal power. So, do you ever think about, in terms of triage, if your end goal is to curb greenhouse gas emissions, is this really the best place to concentrate environmental activism?
I think it's an important place for it. It's certainly not the only place, but I think it's a very important place. Absolutely, coal is an extremely dirty source of fuel that has really turbocharged climate change over the past years. In the United States, thankfully, coal is on a rapid decline. And that has to do with a lot of economic incentivizing by various regulatory agencies and things like that. So in a way, I think that coal is turning into a success story for America, right, in the sense that we're one might argue too late, but we are starting to move beyond coal in meaningful ways. And there's things that are thrown out to sort of muddy the waters on that. Things like clean coal, which is a little like clean dog shit. Right. It's not really a matter of not scrubbing it enough. That's not what makes dog shit dirty. So, coal is a dirty resource that luckily we're moving away from. When we're talking about 93 million tons of carbon every year for 50 years, it's been described by some climate scientists as a climate bomb. That if we do take all of the carbon that's in the ground here and release it into the air, we're looking at a very dreary future indeed. Now that does not suggest that's the only problem, and that's not to suggest that if we resolve that problem, this larger issue will go away. It's not. Yeah. But I think it's an important one to address.
For sure. And here are some of the things to address moving forward too. Here's some of the evidence, I guess, that you could produce to kind of change my beliefs about climate change and maybe cause me to lose more sleep at night over the issue. Some of the things that are unanswered in my mind, I accept that man is causing that anthropogenic global warming is a real thing, that there is climate change happening right now, the oceans acidifying and different things like that. The things that I'm not sure on are the following things: that the unseen cost of creating policy, and to me, all law that government produces is essentially a gun pointed at people, and I'm skeptical of it all right off the hop. I think that it's you have to provide extraordinary evidence if you're going to point guns at people. I think the burden of proof is on the person wanting to point guns, but that's beside the point. That's a philosophical question we could debate. But so I worry about the unintended consequences of policy change. I worry about what it would mean, the ripple effect of, say, oil prices skyrocketing, or oil supplies drying up, or conflict oil being bolstered because more ethical oil in terms of human rights and different things like that. I'm not sure that we know what the consequence of that would be, and I've read a lot of literature that speculates that the cost of implementing some of these carbon taxes and policies would be far more devastating to humanity than just allowing global warming to happen and allowing the sea levels to rise and different things. I mean, that's a scary thought. I don't want to go there.
That seems very, very difficult for me to understand that these consequences of climate change you're talking about would somehow be less than a tax on carbon.
Let me just give you the brief principle of it. I mean, energy is required to fight entropy. I mean, entropy is death, and so the more energy we're able to consume in an efficient way as human beings, the longer we can live, the more flourishing we can have. In the past, people have often lived till the age of 35. We're living a lot longer lives now. We use energy to fight natural pollution, viruses, colds. I mean, you're up here. I'm sure you didn't want that internal combustion engine shut down. There's also
I've got electric socks on.
Right,
my carbon footprint is literal.
Exactly.
But I don't think that the environmental movement is about is a pro-entropy movement, and I think that
right.
the one thing that I would advise everyone to be wary of is that there's been an enormous amount of money by corporate interest that's invested in misinformation.
Sure.
And I think a similar situation, and this has been documented by people much more thorough than myself, but there's a similar situation in the tobacco industry in the 80s and into the 90s, applying misinformation to muddy the waters intentionally on an issue, to bring science into question in order to perpetuate a business model. And so, you know, I would just be aware of that, and you know,
sure.
And know that it's extremely well funded on the other side.
And I am aware,
Sure.
you know, obviously the corporate powers. I mean, there's climate change denial is huge in the libertarian community, and part of the reason I think is exactly what you say. Corporate interests are at work, and I'm no fan of corporations, and I'm not, you know, but getting back to some of the other evidence that could be, so one of the things before I'd want to see policy enacted, a gun pointed at people saying thou shalt not emit carbon anymore, or some version of that. That's one thing. Now another thing might be.
We cut you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
That happened and I didn't hear it.
Okay.
But it's for audio, right?
Well, yeah, we still got the audio, so I'll just go back up a little bit. So some of the other evidence that might be presented to me. I mean, I talked a little bit about the worry about the economic repercussions, and I'm not just talking about money in the economy. I'm talking about biological human life being affected by their ability to consume energy and be able to do the things that they need to do to not just survive but flourish and live long lives and healthy lives. That's one concern. Another concern is that a thing that I would like to know is what is the correct amount of carbon dioxide to have in the atmosphere? What is the limit? What is the amount, and what's the evidence for the correct amount?
Well, I think some of these things have been addressed again by people who do know a lot more than I do about these issues. Like Joe Rogan says, I'm not a smart man, but
Right.
I know enough to listen to the ones who are. But I believe that the issue of how much carbon is going to be acceptable to before we start to see some really dramatic feedback loops from things like releasing methane in the Arctic when the ice sheets melt, that's going to release. So there's going to be feedback loop mechanisms that drive climate change sort of exponentially higher. And those amounts have been placed into a carbon budget and globally. And what we need to do is peak our carbon output in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's really scary because we are nowhere near doing that. We're nowhere near peaking. Instead,
Right.
our growth in terms of producing carbon and greenhouse gases is accelerating at this point. So, you know, those numbers are terrifying to me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I understand that there's overwhelming scientific consensus about the idea of anthropogenic global warming. I mean, something like 99% of scientists agree that humans are causing climate change, they're causing global warming. And so I'm waiting for some of the evidence to come in. Like, I'm really not that well read on the subject. I don't know, but
I guess I'm saying that those numbers are. I don't believe the same way that we make those measurements. I mean, the way we get to 99% of scientists agreeing with climate change is that it's looking at peer-reviewed journals over the past 2 years and denoting whether or not those are accepting climate science as part of the core beliefs of those papers.
Right. I guess
99% of those folks are. So it's harder to make that direct, that broad statement of 99% of scientists believe that this carbon budget is appropriate.
Sure.
But it's certainly the consensus of climate scientists that I've been talking to who happen to be extraordinarily knowledgeable folks producing peer-reviewed science on a regular basis.
I guess we talked a little bit. One of the ways that this idea of a carbon budget might fit into a libertarian philosophy is if it can be shown conclusively, that a human being emitting more than X amount of carbon is harming other people, then then you might say that your self-ownership stops at that point, that you can't pass that line. I see all sorts of issues trying to figure that out, trying to enforce that, trying to come to agreement on that. And so I'm not sure that that's necessarily a fruitful avenue of trying to figure out.
I would agree with that. I mean, I guess to me, one of the challenges I see with the libertarian philosophy is that it does involve a lot of theory. And a lot of it, I think from our discussions that you would agree with this, is that we don't have good working models of successful libertarian systems in total. That we don't see a country that we can point to and say, well, that is the libertarian philosophy that you're talking about in action.
Yeah.
You know, I think we do see those examples with. I would propose. I'm not saying that you agree with this, but I would propose that we do see models of successful balances of socialist and free market ideals in like Scandinavian countries, for instance, that seem to be flourishing under those systems. So one of the challenges is that while we're sort of researching the theory of libertarian philosophy, and I think it's an interesting topic for discussion, in terms of practical results that we can get in, especially in this 5 to 10 year window that we seem to be looking at in order to get our carbon output to peak. There's real practical considerations that I think we need to weigh, in terms of idealistic philosophy versus a pragmatic one.
And here's how that kind of sounds to my ear, just in blunt honesty. When you talk about libertarian theory is nice. It kind of reminds me of almost of a parent who is an apologist for spanking their kids, saying, well, in theory, peaceful parenting is good, but I have to get my kid to behave, so I'm going to have to swat him because that's, And so to me, it's almost the other way around. It seems to me that this theory that if we just pile on regulation and use more force and continue down that route, that eventually we'll solve these problems. When that is, to my eye, what has caused the problem to begin with, that the theory that we can initiate force and solve our way out of social problems, this is a long line of cascading domino effects of that, and to continue down that pattern seems to me to just be saying, well, in theory, if we just get the right guy in office, if we just have the right rule in place, then things are going to work. To me, that seems like the theory, the utopia, the wishful thinking, right?
And I think this is where we might fundamentally part ways. I do feel like that there just as a practical consideration, that we do have to do on a certain level a cost-benefit analysis of pursuing a theory which again I just haven't seen work. The libertarian philosophy I don't see working examples. Yeah. So I mean they sound wonderful, but I think we need to see some effectiveness before we would rely on those to solve a crisis that is imminent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess you see, I kind of see libertarianism as the null hypothesis. In other words, it's the default position. You have to provide extraordinary proof to first say that someone has the right to initiate force.
But don't we all say that about our own personal philosophies?
Yeah, exactly. So this is where we're trying to find, I guess, some common ground. So, that would be the null hypothesis from a libertarian perspective. Is if you're going to pull out and initiate force, you better show that you're protecting someone from harm, that you're using it in a protective way. And if you can't do that, then you're violating a human right, because if that's not a universal right, if everyone can't do what you're doing, use that force protectively, then it's not, you can't call it moral behavior, because a moral behavior, as Chomsky points out, has to be universalized. It can't be just for one group of people, maybe popularity contest winners or something like that, who we call politicians. so you can do that. You can be a pragmatist and say, you know what, this group of people is going to initiate force because I just think we need it. It's a pragmatic thing.
By initiating force, you mean regulating industry?
No, well,
I mean, that's right, right?
I'm talking about individuals, not industry. Industry is an abstract concept. It denotes corporations and other abstract entities. Yeah, I've got no problem with regulating those. I just wish they didn't exist, to be honest with you. I see them as a byproduct. I see them as a byproduct of regulation to begin with. You know, the articles of incorporation of saying, here's an imaginary entity, and when I sin by polluting waters or doing this or that, I'm safe. The corporation's at fault. Let's prosecute the corporation. Let's have it be the sacrificial lamb. And I get away scot-free. I have no, you know what I mean?
And that might be some of the common ground that we're talking about, in the sense that I think we both agree that the free markets that are so often discussed aren't actually free. That oftentimes what we're talking about is people wanting to define something as a free market because it maintains a status quo that benefits their business model, and that's not really the sort of freedom that I think you're talking about.
So let me ask you this. So I kind of presented some of the evidence that would be compelling to me to change my mind about how we move forward on climate change. What are some of the things that might be compelling to you to change your mind about climate change? What are some evidence that could be presented?
Well, I would want scientific evidence, and you know, I consider myself a pragmatic humanist, and so I'm looking for practical solutions.
And scientific evidence of.
I would what I would like to do is follow science to its conclusions on scientific issues. So if 99% of scientists believe in climate change, and the consensus among the scientific community is that a carbon budget needs to be followed in order to prevent disaster, I support policies that will implement that.
Well,
so in order to change my mind, I would need to see the sciences.
But I guess what we're talking about isn't really. Well, it might be a scientific question. I guess policy questions could be considered scientific.
But I hear what you're saying. If in order to convince me that there might be a different way to
like
implement a carbon budget.
What if 99% of economists said that, you know, the repercussions of this type of policy could foreseeably cause huge catastrophe?
That would definitely make me rethink my position. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, from what I've read, there are some outliers among economists, and economy being, I think, the study of economics, and I think economists would agree with this, being vastly different from, say, the study of water, of hydrodynamics, or some other scientific field where we can do empirical testing. Economics is a different sort of science. It's, you know, a social science. So you know, if there were a broad consensus among economists that this weren't going to be effective, I would certainly want to consider that. And if it were an overwhelming consensus, that would, I think, change my mind.
Right. Well,
from what I see, the evidence among economists, and again, economists, these conclusions being soft conclusions as opposed to more empirical sciences, but that the consensus among economists tends to lean in the other direction.
Sure. Yeah, and so I guess I'm just looking for the evidence that would convince you from. So. What are some ways then that we can move forward? So we have a libertarian and a kind of a left-wing progressive guy. How do we move ahead on this issue? What are some common ground areas that you could see us potentially having some constructive work going forward on?
Well, you know, I think it's an exciting dialogue. You know, I'm interested in ideas of alternate ways to limit carbon emissions, and alternate ways to prevent climate change. I think we do have some fundamental disagreements. But I think it's great. It was wonderful in the podcast yesterday to hear that, people in your circle of friends and in your community, to what you described as a unanimous degree, are accepting of climate change. I wish that were true in my community. I wish that were true in my circle of friends. I think it's broadly true, but even in liberal lefty LA, I know plenty of people who are climate change deniers, and I think that's. I think it is through dialogue that we're going to start to move beyond that.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that I see moving forward is, I kind of look at this as it's almost this narrative of you versus me, environmentalist versus libertarian, whatever, is a little bit of a false dichotomy. It's almost a constructive, a divisive narrative that's been purposely engineered in a lot of ways, I think. It's kind of like the pro-life versus pro-choice debate. I mean, at the end of the day, I think nobody wants to see abortions numbers climb, that we would like to see that trend line go down. And so, in a lot of ways, it's it's a silly argument to argue, well, I believe in a woman's right versus I believe in we want to see abortion go down. So how can we cause the trend line to go down in abortion? How can we cause the trend line to go down in global warming and harm and pollution and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm not sure that I know a concrete answer that we will both agree on. But I'm sorry, we do need to get to our plane at some point.
Yeah.
But let me just leave you with this. I think that's a great analogy with abortion. Is that to me, abortion is a real it's a false conflict. And I think it's been perpetrated and perpetuated by politicians who stand to benefit from that dispute, and that's why it's called a wedge issue. It's used as a wedge to drive people apart who actually want the same thing. You're right. Lefties don't sit around throwing abortion parties where it's like, oh boy, we got another one. Quite the contrary. We treat abortion as the same traumatic tragedy that I think a lot of people in pro-life families do. Nobody wants to see it happen because it's very difficult for a woman to go through, and we should try and reduce the circumstances that make it happen. Right. And similarly, I think that there are people who stand to profit from us having conflict.
Right.
And I think we should fight that at every opportunity and seek common ground at every opportunity. And remember that we are on the same side of this issue and that we are the ones who have to breathe.
Right. And I would add to that and say, in a lot of ways, libertarians view, that approach as our approach to industry. Okay, we want to see abortion go down. We want to see pollution go down. How can we do it without pointing the gun at the mother holding the baby and telling her she has no rights? How do we create an incentive, the underlying incentive structure that makes that even a viable option to have an unwanted pregnancy to begin with? And I think we have a lot of common ground in that area, and that we have dialogue moving forward. But I don't want to hold you guys up anymore. I have enjoyed working with you guys the past week. It's been a great...
Sure has, man. It's been terrific. And I've loved talking to you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And so where can people check out your work? When can we expect to see the film, all that stuff?
The film is a work in progress. So we are... The answer is as soon as possible and as many places as we can possibly have it. You can check out more of our work by looking for Heavy Crude Video on the YouTube machines, the Facebook machines, and all the interweb machines that your viewers may be familiar with. Right. And you can find me at Andy Cobb on Twitter, and AndyCobbOnline.com, all one word. And it really has been a real pleasure, and it's great to meet a friend.
Well, it's been great to meet you. And we talked earlier. I pitched these guys the idea of an environmentalist from Fort McMurray going down to Los Angeles to shut down the greenhouse gases there. You know, they produce just as much greenhouse gas there, a little bit more actually than Fort McMurray. They have a lot more smog, toxins. They have all sorts of social justice issues around marginalized, exploited minorities. And so I'm going to go down there and I'm going to sort things out, get to the bottom of this, and see if we can't shut down this blight on the Earth.
I think that is a super fun, awesome idea, and I hope you come and stay at our house when you do it.
That sounds like a plan. I look forward to carrying on this conversation with you because I think there's some constructive things. I think it's not a process for a lazy man.
That's
you know,
right.
the lazy man just lobs bombs at each other, but I think what we're doing here is some good work, and so thanks
Right on,
guys.
buddy.
Fort Mac Philosopher out.